Perfect. Okay, it's going.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining, and it's my pleasure to say hi to my good friend Jack Lynch. Jack and I went to Penn together, graduated the same year, and lived in the same dorm for I think 3 years.
Yep.
Jack got his bachelor's in English from Penn and went on to get his PhD in English from Penn. Is now a professor at Rutgers University and head of the English department. And if you know anything about academia, being the head of the department is basically a big pain in the neck where you deal with arguments about email systems and parking spaces. Jack is a well-respected Shakespeare scholar. Jack is very familiar with the UK. He spent his high school years near London and is a regular visitor to London as well as Oxford. And a couple of years back, not sure how many, Jack had a fellowship at All Souls College at Oxford. So it's always good to catch up with Jack and his wife, Laura, when they're here. So I've never actually done a book club before, but I'm going to start with a question to Jack based on the book. I have an old edition. And then I think we can just go around and people can share surprising things they took away from the book, things they didn't know that they learned about. You're certainly more than welcome to ask Jack a question, but don't feel compelled to. I'm sure Jack would be happy to just bask in the warm glow of appreciation for this book. So my opening to Jack is my favorite chapter is the one on the forgeries. And this remarkable fellow, William Henry Ireland, who seems to be quite a character. And I wasn't aware that there were fake spears. But it's been almost 15 years since you wrote this book. So since the time you wrote it, have you or others in the Shakespeare scholarly community found anything new about forgeries?
There's always discoveries of little forgeries of all kinds. Rarely anything as exciting as a whole Shakespeare play that turns out to be a forgery, but constant little pieces of evidence are debated and accepted and rejected. But we now live in a world, the forger who's probably done the most damage to actual scholarship came after William Henry Ireland. In the 19th century, John Payne Collier. Now, Ireland is the guy I know really well. I've spent a lot of time studying him. He's a fascinating character, but he was a lousy forger, and no one should have fallen for it. And if you see his stuff today, you can recognize it as forged. John Payne Collier was a serious Shakespeare scholar, and his forgeries are a lot more subtle. And to this day, if anything might have passed through his hands, we're not sure if it's been doctored. So we still live in a world where forgery screws up what we think we know about Shakespeare and his contemporaries.
All right. Okay, let me just open the floor.
Yeah.
Well, I'll ask after reading your book, which I found fascinating. I also read some about the whole Shakespeare is not Shakespeare, whether it's a conspiracy or the different camps. What is your take on that? The evidence that Shakespeare was not Shakespeare can be pretty compelling. The problem seems to be there's no evidence of anyone else being Shakespeare. I just wondered what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, it's an area that most scholars are hesitant to touch because it attracts a whole lot of cranks.
Yeah, but there are some pretty prominent Shakespearean actors who...
There are some actors, there are some lawyers and people like that. My take on it, what it comes down to, there are some frustrating gaps in the record about Shakespeare. There are a lot of things we wish we knew that we don't. We have no evidence he ever went to school. We have no evidence he ever traveled abroad, things like that. And that leaves some room for doubt. On the other hand, there is no non-royal human being from that era who has been scrutinized more thoroughly. And there's nothing about his life that is not compatible with his having written these plays. And as you point out, no other candidate seems to be in line. There have been dozens and dozens of people suggested as the true author of Shakespeare's works. The leading candidate these days is Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. He's the most popular of the rival claimants today. There's the little inconvenience that he died before about a third of Shakespeare's plays were written. So you really have to go out of your way to twist the record around to say, yeah, I know that this work quotes something that was after Oxford died, but maybe it was added later. Oxford just isn't a plausible candidate. So yeah, there are gaps in the record. We wish we knew more, but there isn't room for anyone else really. Where there is room for a lot of interesting questions is we often forget Shakespeare has become this sort of solitary genius figure for us. And that's just never been the way theater works. Shakespeare was not writing in his study and handing his pages over to his publisher. He was writing for an acting company. Things would get tried out and changed. Things would get adapted. Things would get revived after 5 years and tried again. Almost certainly a whole lot of Shakespeare's work is collaborative in a lot of ways. So there's room for other authors to have been part of the Shakespeare phenomenon. And now we're looking at increasing evidence that some things that we have attributed to other authors might have Shakespeare's hand in them. And a whole lot of things we've attributed to Shakespeare probably have other people's hands in them as well. But yeah, that's my take. There's not a whole lot of room to believe any of the other claimants to the throne. And there's nothing that makes it impossible for us to believe William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was the author.
So I have a question. I guess for me, one of the things reading the book, I had no idea kind of how much people kind of manipulated Shakespeare, for their own goals, whether that's political, other royal things, or just in terms of promoting like morality, right? And so that was new to me. And I think it's the term what's myriad-minded. So I guess kind of two questions. So the first one is there any other author, in your opinion, who has, I guess, achieved that level of myriad-mindedness across time? And then the second question, I know in one of the chapters you talked about even recently how I think it was a King Lear play was adapted kind of based on the politics of the day. But since you've written the book, have you seen any other kind of, I guess, either any plays that have been put on or any movies or anything like that that have kind of twisted the Shakespearean original story?
Good questions. As for other authors in that position, there's probably no one else in English who's got quite the same situation in our Anglophone shared consciousness as Shakespeare has. But there have been others in other literatures and cultures. I mean, for many centuries, to be Greek was to treat Homer almost as if it was scripture. Homer provided evidence on how to structure societies and how to treat your wife and how to go to war and all of that. So Homer had that position for the Greeks. I think Dante, to some degree, has had that position in Italian culture for a long time. But Shakespeare is probably unique in that respect in English, partly because of when he became a big deal, partly because of how he got integrated into our educational system fairly early. So he became the great figure, which is a little unfair to a lot of other great figures, but there's an institutional reason for it. As for whether things are still being done like that, yes, constantly. Nowadays, we've got an attitude that if you're going to do something to Shakespeare, there are two categories of things that are acceptable. There is keep all of Shakespeare's words, but do something with the physical setting or the characters. So it's perfectly acceptable in the modern theater to take a 16th century play and set it in the 21st century. And instead of soldiers from ancient Rome, you can make them 21st century soldiers. You can turn the daggers into guns. Just last night, I saw that PBS has made available for streaming here, not internationally, alas, a version of Much Ado About Nothing that's made it entirely about contemporary African-American culture. But those productions keep Shakespeare's words as if they're scripture and things are changed around them. Or we've decided you can be inspired by Shakespeare and do something that sort of follows the plot, but doesn't pretend to be Shakespeare. So, oh, blast. Smiley, what's her, I'm blanking out on her name. But yeah, I mean, there are novels where the plot is inspired by King Lear, or West Side Story, which takes Romeo and Juliet and things like that. What I find fascinating in the period I study the most is they had a different category, which is take Shakespeare's words and change them whenever you like for stage production. And nowadays, that would be regarded as outrageous to say that this is Shakespeare's play, but some of the words are not his. It would be regarded as an outrage, a sacrilegious attack on our great scripture. The 18th and early 19th century had no hesitation whatsoever to write whole new speeches if they were called for. It was only around the middle of the 19th century that his words started to become sacrosanct.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just funny because it seems like such a paradox almost where it's his words are scripture, but at the same time you can change them however you like. So it just doesn't, you can't keep it straight in your head.
What I really like, the period I studied the most is the 18th century. And that, to my mind, is the time when the really interesting stuff with Shakespeare is happening. And we get two traditions that are happening at exactly the same time, but pulling in very different directions. And one is, for the first time, this popular playwright who wrote in English is getting scholarly treatment. Scholarship had never before that point bothered with English authors. To be a scholar meant to study Latin, Greek, or the Hebrew Bible. So scholarly lexicons and commentaries and concordances and all of those sorts of things were only for the classics. And in the 18th century, people start doing that to Shakespeare, making him into a classic, figuring out exactly what he wrote. So that's happening on the scholarly side. On the stage, almost anything goes. So while you've got the scholars busily figuring out exactly which commas belong to Shakespeare, you have King Lear being given a happy ending. And if you went to see The Tragedy of King Lear anywhere in the English-speaking world between 1681 and 1836, they all lived happily ever after.
Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. All right. Anyone else? We've got a couple more people in the room. We've got Carol, Diane, Vince. Come on, I know you're with us. Everyone's on mute.
I will, if anyone else, please feel free to jump in. But Daniel mentioned at first the forgery. And one of the things I've managed to acquire since I wrote the book, if you've got to the last chapter, some of you may not, that's fine. I talk about worshiping Shakespeare, where he becomes a sort of secular saint in English and gets all of the treatment that saints had before. And I tell the story of Shakespeare's mulberry tree. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't got there, I'll just do a quick summary of it. There was a legend in the 18th century that the very old mulberry tree that stood on the grounds of the house where Shakespeare once lived was planted by the poet's hand itself. This actually might even be true, because at the time Shakespeare lived in that house, there was an effort to plant mulberry trees all over England. And there was a reason for that. Silkworms live in mulberry trees. And England was becoming addicted to silk, and they didn't want to have to depend on China to produce it. So King James I starts this program where he's trying to get people to plant mulberry trees in England, hoping they can create domestic silk. Never caught on, but they did plant a whole lot of mulberry trees around the time Shakespeare lived in this house. So maybe he did plant this tree. Fast forward to the middle of the 18th century, when Shakespeare's going from a pretty good playwright from a long time ago, I think, to God. And the house Shakespeare retired to, New Place, is now owned by a vicar, Francis Gastrell, Vicar of Frodsham. I've always loved the name Vicar of Frodsham. And this is not a blue plaque house or anything. This is just an old house the guy lives in. And Gastrell has no interest in Shakespeare whatsoever. But Shakespeare's cultural stock value is going up. So tourists begin hopping Gastrell's fence and going in and breaking off pieces of the mulberry tree so they can have a relic of Shakespeare's own tree. And Gastrell gets increasingly pissed off about this. And then one day he just chops the tree down to say, "Stop bothering me." He chops it down. A very clever and entrepreneurial watchmaker, a guy named Thomas Sharp, bought the wood. And Thomas Sharp spent the next 50 years spinning off relics made from the true cross. And as with the actual true cross, there's enough stuff to fill forests of trees, far more than ever could have come from one tree. But I managed to acquire a piece of it. I got a snuff box made from the wood of Shakespeare's mulberry tree. And we've got you can't see it on the screen, but there's a little inscription inside dating it back to 1818. So it's got a bit of history. Now, I have no illusion whatsoever that this is the real tree, but I wanted to participate in the tradition. I could, of course, have bought any piece of mulberry wood and declared it.
Right.
But no, I wanted to engage in the transaction of buying something that had been sold as Shakespeare's mulberry tree. So I've now got my little snuff box, and that's made me immensely happy.
Right. Very good.
So this is a very general question or discussion point. So, stating the obvious, I think no one has ever used language to better effect than Shakespeare, leaving aside the question of Dante and Goethe and outside English, but I still think that's probably true. And no one's ever had sort of a better understanding of human nature than Shakespeare, or crafted better stories or characters. So those are sort of statements of the obvious, but there's no reason why those two attributes should reside in the same person, right? It's not at all obvious to me that the best poet should also be the best person. So I don't know what my question is, but have there been, for instance, have there been poets who've who've been great with language, but just not had very interesting things to say? Or have there been great analysts of the human condition who just haven't been very good at writing? Is there some sort of half Shakespeare out there who could have been a Shakespeare had they only had the other attribute? Or alternatively, why is it so that this one person had brought together these two very distinct attributes?
That's a really fascinating question and hard to pursue with a whole lot of counterfactuals. But I mean, certainly we can imagine any number of authors who are excellent at one thing but never quite made it into the top rank. I'm actually taken by some of the arguments. I don't want to say I accept these outright, but I like thinking this way. And I'll start with an extreme version of the statement. You said Shakespeare has unique insight into human nature. The critic Harold Bloom, who died about a year and a half ago, stated it very boldly and paradoxically, and said, yes, that human nature was Shakespeare's invention.
That was what I was going to ask you. Yes.
And I mean, clearly that's going for he's looking to be quoted more than he's making a factual statement. But I'd suggest to some degree Shakespeare's excellence consisted in changing the criteria for greatness. And there's a critic, Jonathan Bate, at Oxford, and I love to steal this line from him. He says that we know Shakespeare was a genius. There's no question he was a genius. Why do we know this? Because we invented the category of genius to describe William Shakespeare. Before that, the word genius in English meant sort of a spirit of a place. It was a term from classical mythology, sort of related to genie, actually. And then you could talk about your character. You would have a genius could mean having a talent for something. But in the 18th century, the word genius starts to become a description of a person. A person is a genius rather than has a genius. And that really comes out of attempts to explain their love for Shakespeare, even though he didn't follow the rules that were understood to be what made a poet great. So I like to think that to some degree, Shakespeare's greatest claim on our attention is that he rewrote the rules for the things we look for. Certain kinds of language, certain kinds of depiction of character. He was doing them well. Others didn't much care about them until we decided he's the great one, and now we have to measure others against him. So as I said, I don't know if I buy those arguments entirely. It's easy to go too far and say, he was just a nobody, a schmo. We picked him and then decided that clearly that's not plausible. We wouldn't say that any other author, any randomly selected author could become the standard for excellence. But I do think there's something to it.
Thank you. And I was thinking of the Harold Bloom. I just didn't want to mention another academic's name in my question. Yeah, I was always freaked out by the whole invention of the human thing, saying no one had ever fallen in love before he wrote Romeo and Juliet.
Right.
I just didn't know what to do with that.
Yes, Bloom was a fascinating character, weirdo in all kinds of ways, but was fabulously learned. And I think he knew he was exaggerating in all kinds of ways, but it is a refreshing way to think about it. Now, mind you, a whole lot of what we assume Shakespeare was good at is in some ways he wasn't. A lot of the things that we like to credit him for is stuff that he stole from others. Around the same time Shakespeare is becoming the genius at the heart of English literature, the word original starts to change its meaning to its modern meaning. Nowadays, when we say someone or something is original, we mean it is its own origin. It's not imitating anything that came before. Up until the middle of the 18th century, original meant going back to the origins. So Milton's Paradise Lost was praised as original because it was rewriting Genesis. And people are often surprised to discover we have 37 plays we are pretty confident Shakespeare wrote or co-wrote. There are a number of others that are around the edges where people still fight, but 37 are pretty certainly in the Shakespeare canon. Of those 37, only one has a plot that we can't find in another book.
Oh, I thought it was 3. I thought it was 3 or 4.
Only The Tempest has its main action not coming from any one obvious book.
Well, what about Merry Wives of Windsor?
Merry Wives of Windsor it's adapting some, it's
I'm
a
not
combination.
Arguing, I'm just interested.
What was that?
I'm not arguing, I'm just interested because I always thought that, and there's Winter's Tale. I thought there were 3 or 4, obviously Tempest. So anyway, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he's doing things to them, but in many cases right. You can say that this plot strand with Leontes or this plot strand with Mistress Ford, that comes from this one.
Right.
So he's often mashing them together. But if you've ever seen the movie Shakespeare in Love, yep. It's great fun. It's a beautiful movie, and it's both witty and sappy, and it's got everything going for it. But its assumption, the shtick around which it is built is William Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet because he fell in love with a woman he could not have, and his side and theirs were at war and ended tragically and so on. In the movie, he was working on his play called Romeo and Ethel the Pirate's Daughter, but abandoned that to write about Juliet because he actually fell in love. And a great Shakespearean scholar named Peter Holland said, "It's a beautiful story, but that is not how Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet. I know exactly how Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet," says Peter. "He sat at his desk and opened up in front of him on this side Arthur Brooks' poem, The Tragical History of Romeus and Juliet. And over here, he took a blank piece of paper and he looked back and forth and copied out vast stretches of it. And that was perfectly acceptable in the 16th century theater. He did interesting things with it as he adapted it, and that was one of the standards of excellence of the day. Our age does not permit that as a kind of excellence, so we've sort of erased it from our imagination, and we've made his brain the place where all of these things came into being. But yeah, he was good at doing what a workaday playwright was, which is adapting source material.
So the whole Julius Caesar thing he didn't invent. I'm just kidding.
I kind of like to build on that because I'm thinking, because I happen to be sitting under the fiction section of my so-called library. And if I think of authors who have that combination of seem to having really powerful insights to human behavior and also being articulate, I'm looking at my collection of Kurt Vonnegut. I'm wondering if it isn't, because a lot of times you'll read something they'll have a character say or the narrator say, and you think, wow, that is so true. And I wonder, isn't it just because they have the gift of finding the words to articulate things that a lot of us kind of know deep down? We've never had the words for it.
The words or the dramatic situations or some, because I'm thinking of someone like Jane Austen. If you tried to extract from Jane Austen the facts about human relationships that we learn from them, they would not be interesting. If we tried to reduce it to a list of propositions, people believe this, people behave this way, it would all be really obvious. But Austen's genius there is both with her light, ironic tone and the situation she puts people in. She makes those reasonably obvious truths ring really true in a way that another novelist might not. So yeah, I'd say some of it is proficiency with the language, some of it is characterization, some of it is putting people in the right situations, using plot to do that. But yeah, I mean, in fact, works of literature that try to teach us something entirely new usually aren't very interesting. What we're interested in is things that we sort of know and we get to know much more intensely. What's the line from T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding? We shall not cease from our exploration, and the end of our exploring shall be to return to where we started and to know the place for the first time. So much of what we think of as learning from literature is really about realizing what we already knew and having someone take us on that trip. I hope I came close to quoting that from memory. I haven't read it in too many years.
Okay. I'm curious. I get to the group. Was there something from the book that you just totally never expected, or was just a real surprise to you that you just didn't see coming, or that you just really took away of, wow, I didn't know that? I open that to the floor. Is everyone quickly reading the book?
Well, it was only my birthday a couple of days ago. So
okay.
That's my. So I think it's not that I knew. I've always been confused about the sort of the timeline of his rise to prominence. Like, because clearly he was successful in his day, and as you said, Jack, he became sort of appreciated in a scholarly sense in whenever it was the 1800s. You tell us, but there was this lag, right? There was like after he died, or the theaters were shut down. Like in the year, I don't know, 1712. Like, were people going to see Shakespeare, or were people reading Shakespeare? But they weren't studying him in school, right? So what happened? What's it like? I think in terms of like graphs over time, like
sure,
he was a big hit when he was in his own lifetime. Did he sort of dip the way down, come back up, and he's just continued on? Like, how does that chart look, and how do I think about how society has viewed him over those 400 years?
Yeah, very good question. Start with, yes, his plays were very successful in their day.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, most people attending these plays would not have known who wrote them. They would not have been leading with the name of the playwright. So it was probably known in the way, we might know the names of television showrunners and things like that. It's not secret material, but most people don't really know who's behind these. So there wasn't a whole cult of Shakespeare during his day, even as his plays were very popular. He dies in 1616. We have virtually no record of it other than the parish church records his death and burial. So it was not newsworthy when this guy died. 7 years later, his buddies publish 36 of his plays. And we are very fortunate they did, because 18 of them were not published anywhere else before that. And had they not done this, we'd be missing half of Shakespeare's canon. They chose to do it in what's called folio format, which is a big, imposing book. And folios were not used for vernacular popular literature. That was for serious stuff. So they were making a statement. This is literature when they chose to publish it in that format. And that the first folio is now, one of the most desirable books in the world. A recent copy sold for $6 million. But there are a few hundred of them still left in the world. Second edition of that comes out 9 years later, and then 20 years go by, 30 years go by without any reprint of it. In the middle, a big part of this story is the theaters get shut down during the Commonwealth. So from 1642 to 1660, for 18 years, there are no public plays in England at all. To put little asterisks on that, I did say public. There would be private theatricals by aristocrats. At universities, they might do a play by Seneca in Latin or something. But as an industry, English plays were not a going interest for 2 decades. 1660, the theaters open up again. This is really exciting. It's going to bring about a new age of theatrical material. Problem is, there are no plays. No one has written a play in 2 decades. The only actors who have any experience are now old because it's been 20 years since they've been able to be on stage. So there's a scramble for new material. What can we put on? And one of the places they look is the old plays, things that had been mostly forgotten. People are now actively riffling through them, hoping to find something that'll work. And a few playwrights from Shakespeare's day benefit from that. So Shakespeare himself, Ben Jonson, Beaumont, and Fletcher, the writing team, their plays are what's being put on in the theater while the world is waiting for new plays to get written. So that's where Shakespeare sneaks back in. That's where he is saved from the oblivion he may have faced. Had there been an ongoing theatrical tradition all along, he might have just faded away. But in 1660, the theaters reopen. They now do a 3rd edition of his collected plays, and then they reissue it with 7 bonus plays. Probably only 6 of them had Shakespeare's hand in them. And he starts to become a favorite on the stage. He is not the critical favorite, but he is the popular favorite. And then as you get from the late 17th century into the 18th, you start getting an interest in what we now call the Renaissance and studying the texts of that era as opposed to just enjoying them. And that's when Shakespeare also becomes a critical favorite. So it's between the reopening of the theaters in 1660 and fast forward about 100 years, and you've got the Stratford Jubilee, which is a 3-day, I like to describe it as a few hours drive north of the big city, a 3-day outdoor festival in late summer 69 devoted to love, peace, and music, which describes both Woodstock and the Shakespeare Stratford Jubilee. And that's where he really becomes an object of adoration. And I like to say that the Stratford Jubilee just never ended. Stratford itself is now 24-hour devoted to worship of its favorite son, when a few decades earlier, most people had no association between Stratford and Shakespeare.
Jack, so the chapter on performing Shakespeare, talks about how Shakespearean actors just can become these huge superstars.
Yeah.
And even these days, if an actor has, Shakespearean training, that gives them a cachet that a lot of other actors don't. Although I was rather surprised recently to learn that William Shatner, Captain Kirk, had quite a lot of experience performing Shakespeare.
Did he now? That's
and
great.
It was because when Christopher Plummer died, it seemed to be mentioned fairly frequently in his obituary that in a number of Shakespeare productions, William Shatner was his understudy. And a couple of times when Plummer couldn't perform, Shatner actually did. For an actor, is performing Shakespeare that much harder than being in Harry Potter or, I don't know, doing a Tennessee Williams play?
Well, I'll say there are a few things going on. One, doing 400-year-old language is probably hard for most actors today. Mm-hmm. The rest of whose repertoire is all pretty recent. So taking language that they probably don't get entirely and making it intelligible to an audience that doesn't get it, that's got to be a real challenge. So there is something to that. I will say I don't claim any expertise in theatrical matters, but people I know who are actors or who deal especially with performance tell me that actors who have worked with Shakespearean lines say that there is something about it that they don't find anywhere else, and it's ineffable. They really have a hard time describing it. But I mentioned the forger that I study the most, William Henry Ireland. One of the publicity things I did for this book, Becoming Shakespeare, was on a few occasions, I got to give a scholarly lecture accompanied by professional actors. And that was great fun because I would set up a scene and they might perform something as Shakespeare wrote it and then perform it again as the Bowdlers cleaned it up, or the happy ending of King Lear, get little 5-minute performances. And I did give them the great soliloquy from William Henry Ireland's forged Shakespeare play, Vortigern. And the actors all said that it was a real challenge just to memorize the lines and speak them. They felt awkward in their mouths in a way that actual Shakespeare didn't, even actual Shakespeare works that they hadn't read before. So you hand them something from, Two Gentlemen of Verona, which isn't exactly at the top of the list. They say there's something that makes it memorable and suitable to be spoken in a way that clumsy imitation just felt utterly different in their mouths. I wish I had the insight into performance to be able to quantify what is missing, but couldn't quite bridge that gap.
Cool.
You'll remember, you mentioned Shatner. The one of the big bits of excitement about Star Trek: The Next Generation in the 80s when we were starting at Penn was it was going to have a real live Shakespearean actor in it. And that was a signal to everyone. Oh, this is going to be something serious and respectable. Yeah, it's amazing how that label brings a whole category of respect to it wouldn't otherwise have.
Can I pop up with a question? I know I came late, so somebody may have already asked about this. But you wrote about in the book on this topic of making things somewhat difficult to not quite translate, but that there were many different versions ultimately of the way he had written the plays originally, and then you have different words and different. has there, now that there's been so much scholarship, is there a sort of, has there ever been a definitive, or do you as a scholar put greater weight upon one rather than the other? And how do you find that actors view this topic of different words and translations, so to speak?
I'd say if anything, we've gotten further. Scholarship has largely given up on the thought that there is a definitive text. So textual critics now, which is to say the people charged with figuring out what the words should be, used to share this vision that we will work according, we will use these methods, we will be scientific and scholarly about it, and we will get as close as possible to the true text of the play. I think most textual critics today say it's a mirage. There is no such thing as one true fixed text we're going to reach. And what we need is multiple possibilities. Now, mind you, that's probably true of a great many authors, but a whole lot of authors just, there isn't a market for multiple competing editions of, I'm looking at, I've got on my shelf the works of the Duke of Buckingham, who got his first scholarly edition in 200 years recently. Let's say no one's going to do that again on different principles anytime soon. But Shakespeare remains popular enough and enough of a financial draw that you can afford to have. We'll take one of the classic instances of a really difficult textual problem in Shakespeare. We've got King Lear. And we've got the folio version of King Lear that was published 7 years after Shakespeare's death by his friends. And we've got a quarto version of King Lear, which was published while he was alive, but not with his oversight. And there are several hundred lines that appear in each one, but not in the other. And many places where we have the same lines, but still significant differences in the wording. And the question is, congratulations, you're in charge of publishing a new version of King Lear. What do you do? And since the 18th century, from 1725 to 1986, the usual idea was, well, any drop of Shakespeare is too precious to lose. So let's take all the lines in both versions and stuff them together. So even if these lines were in A but not in B, and these versions are in B but not in A, we'll put them together into one big one. And then where you've got individual word choices that differ, there was room for disagreement, but we put out this one mega text. Now there is room for an edition of the folio version, an edition of the quarto version, an edition of ones that merges both of them, an edition of those that preserves old. We've got all of these different texts to choose among. So scholars tend to like that. There is no such thing as a final text. I have found my students hate that. They get really upset when you tell them that, no, I've read Shakespeare. Don't tell me I haven't read Shakespeare's words. And obviously an acting company, you can't pause and run through multiple words that could be spoken at this moment. You have to pick something. So we're now in an era of a whole lot of turbulence with that. A few other works with big differences where there is a market. There are two very different versions of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But again, Frankenstein is important enough that you can have a Penguin World Classics, you can have an Oxford World Classics, you can have a Signet edition, you can have a Norton, and so on. So there's room to try different things. Other works, the only way to get to see the multiple versions is to dig up the original texts.
Thank you. That's fascinating. There's something about certainty and authenticity that it sounds like people look for and your students must look for as well. That I had studied history of art and we read Walter Benjamin's The Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Yes. And so there was always this instinct to find what is the original, and there's such the aura and all of that. And so that really struck me when I was reading that part of the book.
Well, and think about particularly with the drama where, okay, sometimes when we have, say, a quarto version of something and a folio version of something, and they are similar but not identical, sometimes there is reason to think that one version is what Shakespeare probably wrote at first, what he did in his study, and another version probably represents something closer to what eventually ended up on stage after it had been tried out, after they realized, let's give this line to this guy. And we see little things like sometimes the quarto versions will say, enter king with some attendants. And then in the folio, it might say enter king with and give 3 names. Because when you're putting a play on stage, you cannot have some attendants walk on. A finite number of human beings have to walk on. So that's led sometimes to think that, all right, the quarto is probably his first version, or at least close to it. The folio is after it's been tried out. But then it raises the question, if that is true, if quarto is his private version and folio is the collaborative version, which one of these should be preferred? And we have this notion that, well, Shakespeare is the great genius. Anything that changed Shakespeare must be bad. At the same time, Shakespeare wrote knowing that his works would undergo this sort of collaborative transformation. He might well have been embarrassed to think that his unrevised work would go out there into the world. He'd just understand. Of course, his plays would be what we'd say workshop before they went on. So there's plenty of room to argue over what we even should prefer, if we even knew with anything like certainty what each text represents. Very often we get 2 versions and we have no basis for guessing one is better than the other, or one came from this versus. But even when we have reason to think we understand the reasons for the differences, it doesn't settle the question of which one we should follow.
I can ask something. Again, reading your book led me to read some other stuff about Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And what surprised me, as much as we talk about his genius and his insight into human nature and what was going on, how political he was, in that his plays were definitely tuned to the politics of the time.
Yep.
I mean, maybe you want to comment on that. And it was an era of high censorship, and you had to be politically correct. I guess
you'd have to be at least politically savvy. Now, one of the curious things about Shakespeare is, even though we have studied him and his works more intensely than any other author, we know surprisingly little about his politics or his religion and all of these. We know certain topics clearly fascinated him. This wouldn't work this way in the 16th and 17th century, but in a way, just to use the analogy, we don't know who he would have voted for. We don't know which side of most public issues he would have come down on. We know he clearly thought about them a lot because he's obsessed with these questions of power and representation, but we often don't know what he really believed. We do know that he sometimes sucked up to power, because Macbeth was written right at the time that James VI of Scotland became James I of England. And when he was James VI of Scotland, he wrote a book called Demonology. And the book is filled with references to the king's own book. So it was written for performance at court. And clearly Shakespeare was thinking, I'm going to take a whole bunch of things the king himself wrote and say them back to him. So he'll know we're good, loyal servants. So there are things like that where he was looking to ingratiate himself with power. There were also a few times we know he came close to getting in real trouble. So Richard II is about a weak monarch who loses his throne. And at a time when there was a near rebellion that tried to unseat Queen Elizabeth, the head of the rebellion, the Essex, managed to get Shakespeare's company to put on a production of Richard II. And no one would have missed the resonance of, there is danger that the monarch is going to be toppled. Hey, let's put on a play about a bad monarch being toppled. So we don't know exactly how much control he had over that, but we know his theatrical company did it, and that could have gotten them in a lot of trouble. So yes, his plays did have a lot of political resonance, and he seems to have been doing different things in different local political circumstances. What's really fascinating is that the plays have never stopped having political resonance, and they seem to resonate with just about any later political situation we can set them in. So there have been productions that are meant to shore up a strong monarchy. There have also been Shakespeare productions that are meant to be Republican and tear down monarchical structures. Shakespeare is made the defender of a strong state, but then in communist Hungary, he's made into a rebel against an oppressive political system. So people have found all sorts of political Shakespeares to try out. How many of them he himself would have approved of if he could know them? No way to know. Of course, there is, I've loved a line by the literary critic Northrop Frye talking about how important authorial understanding is. And he makes the case that if we could somehow magically see the production of Hamlet that Shakespeare himself took part in, they wouldn't have had anything like a director, but he presumably would have had a lot of say in what it looked like on stage. That would be a fascinating thing. We would give anything for the curiosity of seeing the original Hamlet. But Northrop Frye says that would not put to an end a discussion of what Hamlet is about. It would not be the definitive production any more than any other Hamlet is. And he points out that William Wordsworth was one of the greatest poets of all time, and his preface to Lyrical Ballads, his prose introduction, is one of the great critical documents in English. But as a work of Wordsworth criticism, it deserves no more than a B+, because authors don't necessarily get what their works are really about in a way that translates. So yeah, Shakespeare's take on these things, love to know them, doesn't settle the questions.
I guess kind of related to the comment about using it kind of for whatever, I guess, political gain at the time and drawing those parallels. For me in the book, the one that really stood out, and sorry if I'm butchering any of the names, it was with William Charles Macready when he was in New York performing Macbeth at the same time as Edwin Forrest, and then how there ended up being a riot in the streets and all of that. And for me, that really illustrated kind of what you're talking about, although I know it was on American soil and, all sorts of things like that. But yeah, just kind of, I guess, going head to head and standing for two completely different things and using Shakespeare in the middle of that.
Yeah. The same playwright, the same play at the same time, two rival productions taking on completely different political meanings. And by this point, you're pretty much sticking to Shakespeare's real words. If you go back to the 17th and 18th century, yeah, rewrite them. That's okay. You can, but by Macready's time, they're all sticking pretty close to Shakespeare's texts, and they can take completely different meanings. It is worth knowing, for instance, that something like Merchant of Venice. Merchant of Venice now can be played in a very sympathetic way to Shylock and to Judaism, but it was also one of the favorite Shakespeare plays in Nazi Germany. So the same words can be supportive of a philo-Semitism and Nazi anti-Semitism. And it's astonishing just how Shakespeare himself leaves that much room for. Nowhere does he stand up and say, hey guys, this is what I actually mean about this. And that he has managed to find situations that echo across 400 years.
Are there any filmed or streamable or otherwise findable productions, presumably from recent times, that particularly resonate with you or you think are particularly noteworthy? I mean, there's so much out there.
There is so much out there, and I've seen bunches of it and enjoyed it, but I'm trying to think, is there anything I would specifically single out? I don't think I've got anything right now. If it comes to me, I'll pass it on.
What do you think of the Orson Welles films and what we know about his other productions?
I just watched his Othello again about a year ago when I was teaching it. As with so much of Orson Welles' stuff, it's utterly brilliant, and it's a fantastic vision and refuses to hang together.
Right, exactly.
I love the fact that his production of Othello was a particular mess because he kept having trouble raising the money, and he would get enough money to film a few scenes, then run out of money and send all the actors away again. And then suddenly, we've now got 3 weeks, we'll try to get another few scenes done. And it took him years to do that. And there's one scene in his version of Othello which is set in a bathhouse where all the characters are sitting around taking a schwitz. But found out the reason for it is the day they were planning to film it, the costumes hadn't arrived. So they just decided to use hotel towels. And that's so typical of Orson Welles, where any still from one of his movies is just the best composed photograph you have ever seen. But you also have to deal with the clumsy dubbing where the mouths don't quite match. So I was delighted, though, that finally the Chimes at Midnight is more or less available again, because for about 40 years, the only way to get that was through some gray market Brazilian DVD.
Spanish.
But it's now out. Was it Spanish? Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's aired a few times, so good to have that one back.
And so I'm from Texas, and I remember in high school reading at least one Shakespeare, if not two Shakespeare plays every year.
Yeah.
And so that kind of ingrained, I could still remember facts without even reading it, so that whenever that was like 10 years ago, right? I still remember Shakespeare's, death and birthday, and I just remember he was born in August and things like that. So they really ingrain it in your head growing up. But, the other day I was with my English boyfriend and his family. We were playing 20 questions, and the person I was supposed to guess was actually Shakespeare. So I was asking all these questions, and the thing is, they didn't really know the answers. And at the end of that game, I found out I knew more about Shakespeare than they did, and I was really shocked by that. And so for me, that got me wondering, well, did you, I was asking my boyfriend, I was like, well, did you study Shakespeare, in high school or growing up? Because I just assumed it was a given because in America, it was ingrained in my head. And he said, no, we didn't really, look at it that much. So I guess from your perspective, is Shakespeare, I guess, first off, in England, to what extent is it taught in schools based on what you know, and also in other countries? Do you know kind of, I guess, how is it incorporated into the educational systems if it is?
I don't think I'm really qualified to answer that because my experience of other school systems is pretty limited. I'll wager other people on this group chat have more knowledge of the English school system. I mean, of course, with the English school system, there's more specialization early. So if you do your A level and English isn't a subject, then you're not getting it. Whereas every American high schooler is presumably getting some Shakespeare every year. I do know that in a lot of places that have an English or British colonial history, Shakespeare assumes an exceptionally large role. So Shakespeare in India is a subject I don't know a lot about, but is a growth industry for scholarship because he represents the culture of the imperial power over which the culture has been deeply conflicted for a very long time. But I'd love to see a serious scholarly take on Shakespeare in India, Shakespeare in Australia, which is still Commonwealth, and so on. But yeah, I'm afraid school stuff is a bit beyond my ken.
Your story is completely unsurprising and normal. Seriously, no, it's completely unsurprising. Yes, and I think there's lots of Americans who will remember Shakespeare less than you do, who came up through the American school system. But yeah, it's just another thing at school, along with everything else. So I think it's more up to the individual. I remember doing Richard III and Merchant of Venice, I think when I was 13, 14, 15. And that was it. Yeah.
And is there any real point for a 13-year-old to be reading Shakespeare?
Well, yeah. And one thing there's this Victorian, I forget, you'll know Jack who wrote this, in Victorian times, is that you can still buy it. This book, it's literally Shakespeare for children. The whole, basically prose reinterpreted, like rewritten as short stories.
Charles and Mary Lamb, yeah.
That's right, Lamb. Yes, that's right. I was going to say husband and wife team or brother and sister. Yeah. And I must have seen it at some point in my life. So I remember reading the foreword, and it's the most patronizing thing you've ever read about how little boys can read this and perhaps they can read it to their sisters too.
Yes.
But yeah, what is the point? I mean, well, maybe when you're 40, but yeah, reading about the Merchant of it, I don't know. Yeah.
I've had particular trouble with, for a long time in America, it was standard for 10th graders to do Julius Caesar. And don't get me wrong, Julius Caesar is a fine play, but I don't think it has a whole lot to say to 14-year-olds. And I strongly suspect the reason it achieved that position in the canon is because at Rugby School in 1887 or something, they all would have been studying Latin and Roman history, and that would have been a way to make their English class resonate with the other things they were learning. It's a hard sell today to beginners who don't know anything about Julius Caesar, who don't know the background to it. Some of them play reasonably well. Romeo and Juliet still attracts a lot of teenage readers. Every so often a new movie will come out and the sales of it will shoot up for 17-year-olds.
But my 11-year-old right now is doing Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah.
And you ask him, so what's it about? Such a hilarious answer.
Did you get an answer? I'd love to. I don't know what Midsummer Night's Dream's about.
Oh, he's sitting right near me. And you watch, there's a BB, if you get yourself a VPN, you can watch there's a BBC production just come out, which is, it's the most like LGBT thing I've ever seen.
I think I saw this one. Yeah.
It's very good. It's very good. It's very fun. It's very high energy. But I was a bit bemused at this being part of his curriculum. But still, it's good.
I think they did 12th Night in my high school. We read 12th Night when I was in high school. But then I think that was one of the school performances as well, I think. And that was sort of it was a bit fun and, a lot of giggles over that. But I found it actually, and we read some Shakespeare when I was growing up, maybe not as much or not as well taught as Carissa, perhaps. But I found it quite disturbing that I've seen articles in the US press recently about canceling Shakespeare. And I just find it quite, there was one that said, William Shakespeare, thou hast been canceled. I think it's quite disturbing. I suppose it's part of a larger, sort of cultural debate that's happening in the US these days. But I found it to be really disappointing that people, can't have a healthy academic debate.
Yeah. I've seen some of those stories, and most of them seem to be one grouchy person in an English department at a college no one has heard of released a statement, and then all of the world's media latch onto it as evidence that the world is coming to an end. I can tell you, I am the head of probably one of the leftiest English departments in the country. We continue to offer abundant Shakespeare classes. We did decide maybe 10 years ago that the English major no longer would need to have a course in Shakespeare, but we said that everyone should have a course in a single author. And Shakespeare continues to satisfy that requirement, and most of our English majors do Shakespeare for that requirement, and they get Shakespeare in a lot of other places. So even in my department, which, as I say, is pretty radical as these things go, Shakespeare gets used in all sorts of ways. And I have some very traditionalist colleagues who do traditional things with it. I also have colleagues who are very proficient in Shakespeare and race, post-colonial Shakespeare, things like that. And I'm not worried that he's going to disappear anytime soon.
So it's all just a bit of sensationalist. When someone gets grumpy, the press likes, they need some news to report, I suppose.
They need news, and it lends itself so easily to our narrative about these crazy academics canceling everything. I tend to find most of them overblown.
I won't worry then.
I think the bigger problem is the structural problem in which humanities in general get a smaller and smaller share of attention and resources at universities. That's far more worrisome than whether the assistant head of a department somewhere has said, let's cancel Shakespeare.
Thank you very much. I'm actually being called away. So I just want to say a massive thank you.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Really looking forward to reading my birthday present.
Thanks for joining.
All right. Thanks for organizing. Thank you.
Sure.
I guess reading the book too, it kind of inspires me to pick up a Shakespeare text again since high school. So with that in mind, I guess what, in your opinion, I know Shakespeare is incredibly popular as we know reading the book and throughout time, but what is an underrated Shakespeare play that you would recommend if I were to pick one up?
Underrated Shakespeare play. I mean, Some of my favorites that aren't in the very top rank of popularity. I love As You Like It. Yeah, it's not an obscure play by any means. Last year, I was going to say recently, then I realized I haven't set foot outdoors in nearly a year. Shortly before we all were locked down, I saw a production of Timon of Athens, which I had never seen, which is by no means anyone's favorite, but was a really curious play to read, dark and I'd never seen a production of that before. What else? Sometimes people skip over the history plays, and some of those can be really fascinating. Richard II might be a good place to start for that. Yeah, so there's some I'd recommend.
Thank you.
The good news is you can't really go wrong with any of them. Some of them will be weird. Some of the late stuff like Pericles and The Winter's Tale are, let us say, not for everyone's taste. If you're looking for Shakespeare in his Quentin Tarantino mode and haven't read or seen it, there is Titus Andronicus. It's now been, I don't know, 15 years or so, but my wife and I were in London for a few weeks one summer and wanted to see a play at Shakespeare's Globe on the South Bank. And they were doing 3 Roman plays in repertory, but we had time to see only one. They were doing Antony and Cleopatra. They were doing, I think it was Cymbeline. Was it Cymbeline? I can't recall. And they were doing Titus Andronicus. And we thought, well, which one do we want to see? Antony and Cleopatra is a later Shakespeare play. And we tend to think of Shakespeare doing his plays at the Globe Theatre. And if you've been to the Globe on the South Bank, that's pretty much what it looked like. They packed a lot more people into it then, but it's more or less the space. It is outdoors. It had then 3,000 people in it. It depended on natural light. Later in his career, Shakespeare's company began performing in Blackfriars Theatre, which was indoors, much, much smaller, depended on artificial light. And when Shakespeare moved there, the language of his plays got vastly more dense. And in a way, it makes sense. People could hear it. You could actually hear the lines in a way you couldn't reliably do in the Globe, which was outdoors. And the modern Globe has to deal with something Shakespeare didn't have to, which is being in Heathrow's flight path. So if you see something at Shakespeare's Globe on the South Bank, every so often a 747 just wipes out 40 seconds of dialogue. So my wife and I looked at that list and said, what do we see? And I said, Titus Andronicus, because if you lose the plot for 40 seconds as a plane drowns it out, doesn't matter. All of these characters will be dead shortly anyhow, in the most gruesome, grotesque ways imaginable. So if that appeals to you, it's a hoot. I love that at that production at the interval, they had to bring out a wet mop for the stage blood that had covered the stage. So the 18th century, by the way, was convinced Shakespeare could not have written that piece of trash, Titus Andronicus, but it's great fun.
As we're kind of winding down, one thing I admit is when I just try and read Shakespeare, I really struggle with it. I find if I read it out loud and actually adopt character voices, it makes a lot of sense. I just find when I read it, I go really slow, and I almost get.
I agree. The same with me. You take a class in Shakespeare and you're told to read the play, and it's really hard to read the play. and then you watch a streaming service or something of a production, and then you say, I really understand it, but reading it, you don't really understand it.
It's a challenge, yeah, because the good production that understands the dialogue, the emotional situation, and delivers it in a way you can get it, can make things vastly more understandable than the words on the page. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there is no equivalent for the footnote when something is simply beyond your hope of understanding. Right. So there are plenty of things that no actor can convey because they are really specific bits of information. So yeah, it is a challenge. I do remember the very first time I'd ever tried to read some Shakespeare. I had the experience that both of you mentioned, and just say, what the hell is this? And then hearing a production, it was magical. All of a sudden, oh wow, those words produced those. I know exactly what they're saying. And now I've immersed myself in 16th and 17th century English enough that I mostly have no trouble with it on the page. But yeah, it's really valuable if you can pair the experiences of reading and seeing, or at least listening.
All right, well, we're coming up on the bottom of the hour. I don't want to cut anyone off, but if no one else has any observations or questions, then I very much want to thank you, Jack, for your time.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. That was really great.
Yeah.
It's been good to meet you, and I hope someday I get to be less than 2 meters from some of you.
I really look forward to seeing you and Laura back in London, maybe later this year.
Fingers crossed.
Okay. I guess we can stop the recording, and thanks everyone for attending. And again,